Okay, so picture this. You're online, right? Adding a new pair of shoes to your cart, all excited for that delivery, and bam, you get an email. Your favorite online store, data breach. And suddenly, all your info, like who knows where it is, floating around in the digital abyss or something.
Yeah.
It's a feeling I think we've all probably had, right? But have you ever stopped and wondered how companies even know this happens? And more importantly, what are they actually required to do about it? That's what we're going to be diving into today.
We're going to take a look at what companies are legally obligated to do both before and after a data breach, all based on this document, outlining those compliance responsibilities.
Yeah, it's like a roadmap almost to understanding how our data is supposed to be handled, right? But I gotta admit, I'm a little surprised, I guess, to hear there's responsibilities before a breach even happens. I always kind of thought it was all about, like damage control after the fact.
That's actually pretty common. It's a common misconception. You see, preventing a breach is so much more effective and less costly than dealing with the fallout afterwards. Like, you wouldn't wait for your house to be robbed before installing an alarm system, right?
Right.
Companies need to be building that same kind of digital fortress around all of your data.
Okay. Okay, I'm starting to see the logic here. So how do they actually go about building this digital fortress?
Well, it all starts with robust security measures. They use tools like encryption, which, basically scrambles your data into an unreadable code. So even if hackers do manage to get in, they can't make sense of it.
Got it. Got it.
It's like imagine you're locking your valuables in a safe with a combination that only you know.
That makes sense. But what about those times when you need to give a website your credit card number? Does encryption protect that too?
Absolutely. In fact, websites handling sensitive information like, credit card numbers, social security numbers, they're actually required to have even stronger encryption protocols in place.
Hmm.
Think of it like, extra layers of security for the most valuable data. On top of that, there's also multi-factor authentication. Those extra login codes they send to your phone or email.
Yeah, yeah.
That's another layer of protection. It's like having a security guard check your ID before letting you into the building, even if you have a key.
So it's not enough to just have one strong password anymore.
Not really, no.
Hmm.
Hackers are getting way more sophisticated these days, so companies have to step up their game as well. Multi-factor authentication helps verify that it's really you accessing your account, not someone who maybe just stole your password. And then finally, companies need to constantly be monitoring their networks for any kind of suspicious activity. Think of it like security cameras and motion sensors, like all around your property. If anything unusual happens, they're alerted and can investigate immediately.
Okay, this is starting to feel like a pretty serious operation. But even with all of these technical safeguards in place, I've heard that human error is still a major factor in these data breaches, right? People clicking on phishing links, using weak passwords, that kind of thing.
Absolutely, you're right. Technology can only do so much. And that's why regular staff training is absolutely crucial. Employees need to be aware of those latest phishing scams. They
True.
have to understand, like proper password practices
Mm.
and know how to handle, sensitive data responsibly. They're like the human firewall.
Yes.
They need to be well trained to recognize and avoid those potential
Yeah,
threats.
like that saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So if one employee slips up, it could compromise the whole system, right?
Exactly. And just like you'd regularly check your home security system to make sure everything's working, companies need to be constantly assessing their digital defenses as well. That's where risk assessments come in. Think of it like a thorough inspection of their entire digital infrastructure.
So they're basically hiring digital security experts to try and break into their own systems.
In a way, yeah, yeah. They use techniques like vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, that sort of thing, to probe for weaknesses and try to exploit them, just like a real hacker would. But the difference is they do it ethically and then they report back to the company. So they can fix those weak points before a real attacker actually finds them.
That's actually pretty clever. So they're always staying one step ahead of the bad guys.
That's the goal, yeah. But even with all these precautions, it's impossible to completely eliminate risk. That's why companies also need to have a solid incident response plan in place. Think of it as a detailed, what if scenario. Like if a breach does occur, everyone knows exactly what steps to take, who to contact, how to contain the damage.
It's like a fire drill, but for data security, right? Everybody knows their role and they can spring into action.
Precisely. The incident response plan outlines, communication strategies, mitigation procedures,
Mm.
and ensures like a swift and coordinated response,
Hmm.
helps minimize panic and make sure that they can address the situation quickly and effectively. But there's one more crucial element companies need to consider before a potential breach, and that's third-party vendor management.
Third-party vendors. What do they have to do with data security?
Well, a lot of companies rely on outside partners, right? For various services, things like cloud storage, payment processing, even like marketing and customer support. And if those partners handle sensitive customer data, they need to meet the same strict security standards as the company itself. It's all about making sure that everyone who touches the data is playing by the same rules.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. You wouldn't want like a weak link in the chain just because it's outside your company walls.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to another really essential aspect. Data subject consent and notification. This is all about transparency and respecting your rights as an individual.
Okay, break that down for me. What does data subject consent and notification actually mean in practice?
Basically, it means that before a company can use your data, especially sensitive information, they need to get your permission. No more burying consent in these really long terms and conditions that nobody reads.
Right, right.
Companies need to be upfront and clear about how they're using your data, and you have the right to know what's happening with your information.
So no more shady fine print. I like the sound of that.
Transparency is key here, yeah.
Hmm.
They need clear, up-to-date privacy policies that explain in plain language how they collect, use, store, and protect your data. You have the right to understand what you're agreeing to and to make informed choices about how your data is used.
So it's about respecting the individual,
Right.
giving them control over their own data, not just treating them like a data point.
Absolutely. It's about building trust. Companies need to demonstrate that they're handling your data responsibly and ethically.
This is all making me feel a lot more informed and maybe a little more secure. But I have to ask, what happens when, despite all these precautions, a breach does occur?
That's a great question. And that's actually what we'll dive into next, those reactive responsibilities that kick in after a data breach happens.
Mhm.
We've spent a lot of time, right, talking about prevention, all those proactive measures companies are supposed to take to protect our data. But I think we all know that even with the best defenses, breaches, they still happen.
Yeah, it's like you can't plan for everything, right?
Exactly. So what happens when those alarm bells, they finally start ringing? What's the game plan?
Yeah, like what's the playbook at that point?
Well, when a breach actually occurs, the very first thing a company needs to do is assess the situation, right? They need to figure out what happened, what data was actually compromised, and who might be affected. It's kind of like a digital detective,
Yeah.
showing up at a crime scene. They need to gather all the evidence before they can actually start piecing together this story.
So they're basically launching like a whole digital investigation.
Exactly. And they need to do it quickly and thoroughly, too, because time is of the essence in a data breach. The longer it takes to contain the breach, the more damage can be done.
Okay, so they're investigating, right? Trying to figure out what happened and how to stop it from spreading further. But what about us? The people whose data might have been compromised, like when do we find out?
That's where notification comes in. Companies have a legal obligation to inform both the authorities and the affected individuals, like as soon as possible. And these notifications, they can't just be vague or generic. They need to be clear, concise, easy to understand.
So no more hiding behind like, a bunch of legal jargon
Yeah.
or burying the news in some 50-page document.
Exactly. Transparency is really key here. Individuals have a right to know what happened, what data was affected, and what steps the company is taking to actually mitigate the impact. And the company needs to lay it all out, like in plain language, so everyone can understand what's going on and what they need to do to protect themselves.
I've gotten those data breach notification emails before,
Hmm.
and honestly, they sometimes just feel like a formality, like a box they need to check.
That's a valid point, yeah.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, some companies do kind of treat it that way.
Yeah.
But remember, these notifications, they're more than just a formality. They're meant to empower you to take action.
Okay, so what kind of action? Like what are we supposed to do when we get one of those emails?
Well, the notification itself should give you specific instructions tailored to the situation. It might tell you to change your password, monitor your accounts for any suspicious activity, or even like freeze your credit if your financial information was compromised. They might even provide resources for dealing with identity theft or offer like credit monitoring services.
So it's like a digital first aid kit almost. They're giving you the tools to kind of patch yourself up, I guess, after a data breach. But honestly, sometimes it feels like those steps just aren't enough. Like, what are companies doing to actually fix the problem? Not just tell us to clean up the mess.
You're right. Notification is just one piece of the puzzle. While they're sending out those emails,
Mhm.
companies also need to be working like tirelessly behind the scenes to actually contain the breach. And this involves identifying and isolating compromised systems, revoking any unauthorized access, patching vulnerabilities, and basically doing everything they can to like stop the bleeding
Hmm.
and prevent any further damage.
Hold on, hold on. How do you even contain a data breach? It's not like a fire they can just put out, right? What does that actually like look like?
Yeah, you're right. It's not a physical thing that you can just, extinguish, but it's about limiting the spread and the impact of the breach. Think of it like a virus.
Yeah.
You need to quarantine that infected system, prevent it from spreading to other parts of the network, and then develop a cure,
Mhm.
which in this case would be like the security patches and fixes that prevent that same vulnerability from being exploited again.
It sounds like a race against time.
It absolutely is, yeah.
Yeah.
The faster they can contain that breach, the less data is potentially compromised,
Okay.
and the lower the risk of any long-term consequences. But containment is just the beginning. Once the immediate crisis is over, the focus shifts to remediation and recovery,
Hmm.
addressing the root cause of the breach and making their systems more resilient to future attacks.
Okay, so they've contained the breach, they've sent out the notifications, and hopefully, stop the hackers in their tracks. What's next? What does remediation and recovery actually involve?
This phase is all about learning from the mistakes, right, and preventing history from repeating itself. They need to analyze how that breach occurred, identify the vulnerabilities that were exploited, and then take steps to actually strengthen their defenses. And this might involve patching software, upgrading security systems,
Yeah.
implementing like stricter access controls, or even revising their entire security strategy. They need to address not only the specific vulnerability that was exploited, but also any other potential weaknesses that could be targeted in the future.
So they're not just like, fixing the hole in the wall. They're reinforcing the entire structure.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, they're essentially building a stronger, more resilient digital fortress to protect your data, with the future. But it's not a one-time fix. Security is an ongoing process. Companies need to constantly be monitoring their systems for any signs of suspicious activity, staying up to date on the latest threats and vulnerabilities, and regularly testing their defenses to make sure they're still holding up.
That sounds like a lot of work. I mean, all this effort, all these procedures and everything. It must be for a reason, right? What happens if companies just ignore these obligations?
That's a great question, and it actually brings us to the high stakes of data breach compliance, the legal and financial consequences that companies face when they fail to protect our data.
Yeah.
So we've talked about those proactive measures, right? The things companies should be doing to protect our data, and the steps they need to take if a breach actually happens. But let's let's get real for a second. What's the incentive for companies to actually do all of this?
Yeah, what's the motivation, right? What happens if they just cut corners or try to sweep a data breach under the rug?
Well, the consequences of noncompliance, they could
Yeah.
be pretty severe. We're not talking about just a slap on the wrist here. Companies that fail to meet these data breach obligations, they can face some pretty hefty fines, legal action, significant damage to their reputation.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. When we say hefty fines, how hefty are we actually talking?
It really depends, honestly. It depends on the specific regulations and the severity of the breach itself. But we're talking potentially millions, even billions of dollars in fines. For example, under the GDPR,
Yeah.
which is the data protection law in the European Union, companies can actually be fined up to 4% of their global annual revenue, or 20 million euros, whichever's higher.
Whoa, 4% of global revenue. That's a huge chunk of change. I bet that gets companies' attention.
It certainly does, yeah. And these regulations, they have teeth. We've seen several high-profile cases where companies have been hit with like massive fines for failing to properly protect user data. It's a clear signal that regulators are taking data privacy very seriously, and they're holding these companies accountable.
So there's a real financial incentive to comply, it sounds like. But beyond the fines, you mentioned something about legal action. Like what does that actually look like?
Well, when a data breach happens, affected individuals, they can actually sue the company that was responsible, especially if they can prove that the company was negligent or didn't take appropriate, security measures to protect their data.
So if a company isn't doing their due diligence, basically, they could be facing like a whole wave of lawsuits.
Exactly. And these lawsuits can be, very costly for companies,
Mm.
not just in terms of like, potential settlements or payouts, but also legal fees, the time and resources required to defend themselves, and of course the potential hit to their reputation.
Right, because who wants to do business with a company that can't keep their data safe?
It's a matter of trust. When we share our personal information with a company, we're putting our trust in them to handle it responsibly. And when that trust is broken, it can be very difficult to repair.
So it's not just about, avoiding those fines or lawsuits. It's about upholding ethical standards
Right.
and respecting the privacy of individuals.
Absolutely. Companies have a moral obligation to safeguard the data that's entrusted to them. And increasingly, consumers are demanding greater transparency and accountability
Yeah.
from the companies that they do business with. They want to know that their data is being handled with care and that those companies are taking data privacy seriously.
It sounds like the stakes are pretty high all around. But at the end of the day, even with all these, laws and regulations and everything, companies they can't prevent every single breach, can they?
That's true. There's no such thing as perfect security, and that's why it's so important for individuals to be proactive about protecting their own data as well.
So what can we do as individuals, to stay safe in this digital age?
Well, first of all, be mindful of what information you're sharing online and with whom. Don't just blindly hand over your personal details to every website or app that asks for it. Read those privacy policies, even if they're long and boring,
Hmm.
and make sure you understand how your data is going to be used.
Yeah, I'll admit I'm definitely guilty of just clicking agree without actually reading those privacy policies sometimes.
We've all been there, but it's really worth taking the time to understand how your data is being handled, and beyond that, use strong, unique passwords for each of your online accounts. Don't reuse the same password across multiple platforms. Consider using a password manager to securely store and manage all of your passwords, and whenever possible, enable two-factor authentication. Just for that extra layer of security.
Those are all great tips. It sounds like we all have a role to play in keeping our data safe.
Exactly. Data security is a shared responsibility. Companies need to implement those strong security measures
Yeah.
and be transparent about how they're handling our data. And we as individuals need to be aware of the risks and take steps to protect ourselves.
This has been a really, really eye-opening deep dive, I think. We've covered a lot of ground, right? From building those digital fortresses to understanding like the consequences of a breach and the steps we can take to protect ourselves. It's definitely a complex landscape out there, but it's one that we all need to navigate.
It's been a pleasure, unpacking this topic with you.
And for our listeners, we hope this deep dive has equipped you with, the knowledge you need to make those informed decisions about your data privacy. Remember, stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep those digital fortresses strong. We'll see you next time on the deep dive.